The crisp autumn air carried the sharp report of precision rifle fire across the training grounds at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 12 distinct shots from an M24 sniper weapon system echoed in rapid succession, each one like the measured tick of a clock counting down to failure. The early morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of the Special Forces training facility where America's most elite warriors were forged in fire and uncompromising discipline. Colonel Richard Thornton stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, a look of barely concealed contempt playing across his weathered face. At 63, he was still built like the Delta Force operator he'd been for 3 decades. 6'2", ramrod straight with steel-gray hair cropped military short. The morning sunlight glinted off the silver eagle on his collar as he watched the qualification course with the critical eye of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be impressed. "Pathetic," he muttered loud enough for the gathered officers to hear. 7 out of 12 on target. Standards have gone straight to hell since I ran this place. The young sergeant, who had just completed his round, lowered his rifle jaw clenched tight at the colonel's public criticism. No one dared contradict Thornton. Not here, not on his turf, not when his word carried the weight of 3 decades of special operations experience and a chest full of ribbons that told stories most men couldn't imagine. As commander of the 3rd Special Forces Group, Thornton ruled Fort Bragg's training grounds like a feudal lord, his authority as immutable as scripture, his standards impossibly high. Because his own mediocrity demanded they be so. "Back in my day," Thornton continued, his voice carrying across the range with practiced authority, "we didn't qualify unless we hit 10 out of 12 minimum." He turned to address the assembled Special Forces candidates, young men who had already survived selection courses that broke 90% of applicants. "You want to wear the green beret, you better damn well earn it." The gathering of battle-hardened warriors and hopeful recruits stood silent. No one willing to challenge the colonel's authority. This was hallowed ground where America's most lethal soldiers were selected, trained, and deployed to protect the nation's interests in the darkest corners of the world. The sound of another rifle being prepared echoed across the range as the next shooter readied himself for judgment. Then came a sound that stopped everyone in their tracks. Not gunfire, but footsteps, light, determined, and utterly out of place in this sanctuary of warriors. Half a mile away, concealed at the edge of the forest line, Sergeant Major Roland Pierce observed the scene through compact military binoculars. At 70 years old, his body bore the marks of a lifetime of service. Scars from Fallujah to Afghanistan, each with its own story of violence survived and brothers lost, but his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as he watched a small figure approach the firing range. A smile creased his weathered face, deepening the lines that decades of desert sun and mountain cold had carved into his skin. The opening move in a game 3 years in the making was about to be played. The small figure appeared at the edge of the firing range, moving with purpose toward the assembled soldiers. The men parted instinctively, their warriors' awareness of the unusual overriding their focus on the qualification course. What emerged from between their ranks made several of them blink in confusion. A 12-year-old girl with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail walked directly toward Colonel Thornton. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple navy blue jacket against the autumn chill, and hiking boots that had seen real use. But she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a military child, that unique combination of discipline and adaptability that came from growing up in the rhythm of reveille and taps. In her small hands, she clutched a framed photograph and what appeared to be an old journal worn at the edges from frequent handling. Her chin was lifted high, her blue eyes focused with an intensity that seemed impossibly mature for someone who should be worried about middle school homework and weekend soccer games. A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the assembled men. Children were strictly forbidden in the training areas of Fort Bragg, especially on live fire ranges. Security protocols were ironclad. This area was restricted to authorized personnel, only cleared through multiple checkpoints, protected by guards who took their responsibilities with deadly seriousness. "What the hell?" Thornton's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade, his face darkening with the kind of anger that came easily to men who viewed any disruption of their authority as a personal affront. "Who let a kid onto my range?" The girl continued forward until she stood directly before the colonel, utterly unintimidated by his towering presence or obvious displeasure. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the suddenly silent range with surprising projection. "Colonel Thornton, sir. My name is Evangeline Harper. I've come to request permission to use the firing range today." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant call of a crow and the whisper of wind through the pines. Then Thornton's bark of laughter shattered the quiet, quickly joined by nervous chuckles from several of his staff officers who understood that laughing at the colonel's jokes, no matter how cruel, was safer than questioning them. "Where's this little girl's mother?" Thornton asked, looking around at his men with exaggerated confusion playing to his audience. The laughter grew louder, more confident. "This is a restricted military facility, not a playground, young lady. How did you even get past security?" Evangeline stood her ground, unflinching despite the mockery. Her voice remained steady, almost gentle, as if she were explaining something to someone who hadn't quite understood the situation yet. "3 years ago today, my father was killed in action in Syria. I want to honor his memory by practicing what he taught me." She held up the framed photograph for Thornton to see. The laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that felt like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Inside the simple wooden frame was a Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor in combat, its distinctive star suspended from a light blue ribbon dotted with white stars. Beside it rested a worn green beret faded from desert sun and mountain snow. Beneath them was a photograph of a soldier in full combat gear, his face bearing a striking resemblance to the girl standing before them. The nameplate on his uniform read Harper. Thornton's smile faded like frost under morning sun as recognition dawned in his eyes. His face went carefully neutral, the practiced expression of a career officer who had learned to hide his thoughts behind a mask of professional composure. "Master Sergeant Marcus Harper," Evangeline said, watching the colonel's face carefully, reading the micro-expressions that flickered across his features like clouds across the sun. "My father." The name fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through the assembled Special Forces operators. The older men exchanged glances heavy with meaning and memory. The younger ones looked confused, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, but not understanding its cause, unaware. They stood in the presence of a legend's daughter. For a moment, Colonel Thornton seemed frozen, his face a carefully controlled mask that concealed calculations and concerns only he could understand. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its thunder, replaced by something harder and colder. "I knew your father, girl." The word girl carried a dismissiveness that was clearly intentional. "He was under my command." He looked around at the gathered men, then back at Evangeline. "But this is no place for a child. How did you even get on base?" "Mrs. Rodriguez at the front gate recognized me." Evangeline answered simply, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had anticipated every question, prepared for every obstacle. "I'm a dependent with proper ID. I've lived on Fort Bragg most of my life." She paused, letting that sink in. "She called ahead to your office, but I guess they didn't tell you I was coming." Thornton glanced sharply at his aide, a young captain who shrugged helplessly, clearly caught off guard by a situation no amount of staff college training had prepared him for. The colonel's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin as frustration battled with the need to maintain his carefully constructed authority. "Well, this is still a restricted area," Thornton continued, his voice regaining some of its earlier hardness. "And even if it weren't, what you're asking is absurd. This is a military firing range, not a memorial site. These weapons aren't toys." Evangeline's gaze never wavered, her blue eyes meeting the colonel's without fear or deference. "I know what they are, sir. My father taught me from the time I was 6 years old." A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Thornton's face darkened again, anger rising like floodwater behind a weakening dam. "Your father had no business teaching a child to shoot military weapons." Now I suggest you turn around and leave before I have security escort you out." But Evangeline didn't move. Instead, she opened the journal she carried and pulled out a folded document, extending it toward the colonel with the same calm determination she had shown from the moment she arrived. "I have all the proper paperwork, sir. Family Support Services approved my request to use the range under supervision for memorial purposes. It's signed by Captain Hernandez from Family Affairs." Thornton snatched the paper from her hand, scanning it with growing irritation. The document was indeed official, bearing all the proper stamps and signatures, each one a small bureaucratic nail in the coffin of his authority to simply dismiss her. Captain Hernandez had even added a personal note explaining the unusual circumstances and requesting special consideration on the 3rd anniversary of Master Sergeant Harper's death. "This is ridiculous," Thornton muttered, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. Denying a formal request to honor a fallen Medal of Honor recipient, especially one filed through proper channels and on the anniversary of his death, could create unwanted attention. The kind of attention that raised questions. The kind of questions that led to investigations into things better left buried. "Colonel," one of the older sergeants said quietly, stepping forward with the careful deference of a man who knew he was walking a dangerous line. "Master Sergeant Harper was a hero. Maybe we could—" "I know exactly who Harper was, Sergeant," Thornton snapped, cutting him off with the sharp authority of a man who would not tolerate his decisions being questioned even gently. His eyes never left Evangeline's face, studying her with a new intensity. "What did you say your name was again, girl?" "Evangeline Harper, sir. Everyone calls me Eva, and I am Marcus Harper's daughter." Something shifted in Thornton's expression, a calculation, a measurement of risk and reward playing out behind his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, a smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those remained cold, calculating, measuring the girl before him like an opponent across a chessboard. "Well then," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "perhaps we should see what the daughter of the legendary Master Sergeant Harper can do." He turned to address the range. "Sergeant Miller set up a target at 500 meters for our special guest." A murmur ran through the assembled men. 500 meters was a serious distance, challenging even for qualified snipers with years of experience. For a 12-year-old girl, it was absurd, clearly meant to humiliate, to send her away with the sting of public failure sharp enough to ensure she never returned. "Sir," Sergeant Miller began hesitantly, a decent man uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. "That's a qualification-level distance. I'm not sure—" "I'm aware of that, Sergeant," Thornton cut him off. "Miss Harper here believes she's qualified to use my range. I think it's only fair we find out if that's true." He turned back to Eva, that cold smile still in place. "If you can hit 3 out of 10 shots on target at 500 meters, I'll sign your range permission myself. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll leave my base and never come back with these ridiculous requests. Do we have a deal?" Eva met his gaze steadily, her young face solemn but unafraid. "Yes, sir, we have a deal." The memories that the name Marcus Harper evoked were powerful among those old enough to remember. The brutal autumn of 2004 in Fallujah, Iraq, remained seared into the consciousness of every man who had been there. The city had been a nightmare maze of bombed-out buildings and narrow alleyways, where death waited around every corner with patient malevolence. A platoon of Marines had been pinned down by insurgent fire, trapped in a killing zone with 3 men already wounded and ammunition running low. Their desperate radio calls for help had gone unanswered for nearly an hour as enemy fire made extraction impossible and reinforcements too dangerous to commit. Lieutenant Marcus Harper, then a young Special Forces operator on his 2nd deployment, had been positioned on overwatch duty 800 meters away. He manned an M24 sniper rifle from a partially collapsed apartment building, his position carefully selected to provide maximum coverage of the Marines' sector, while maintaining concealment from the enemy forces that seemed to materialize from the rubble like jinn from smoke. His spotter sergeant, Major Roland Pierce, lay beside him in the dust and debris, scanning the chaos through high-powered binoculars while simultaneously monitoring the radio traffic that crackled with increasing desperation as the Marines' situation deteriorated from critical to catastrophic. "Command says negative on permission to engage," Pierce reported, the frustration evident in his voice as he listened to the radio. "Captain Thornton wants us to maintain position and await further orders." Harper's face was a mask of concentration as he tracked enemy fighters through his scope, counting them, cataloging their weapons, calculating ranges and wind drift with the automatic precision of a man, for whom such calculations had become as natural as breathing. 8 insurgents with AK-47s and RPGs had the Marine platoon completely pinned down, their fire coordinated and disciplined, their positions carefully chosen to create overlapping fields of fire that made movement suicide. "Those boys have 10 minutes, maybe less," Harper said quietly, his eye never leaving the scope. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had seen enough combat to recognize the mathematics of death. "We're the only ones who can help them." Pierce looked at his friend, understanding the choice that lay before them, the weight of the decision that hung in the air between them like the dust that drifted through the shattered windows. Orders were sacred in the military. The chain of command was absolute, but so was the responsibility to brothers in arms. "Orders are orders," Marcus Pierce said, though his voice carried no conviction. He knew what his friend would do. He'd known from the moment he'd seen Harper's jaw set with that particular kind of determination that meant a line was about to be crossed. Harper was silent for a long moment, his breathing controlled, and even as he watched through his scope. Another Marine was hit, his comrades dragging him to scant cover behind a destroyed Humvee that provided concealment, but no real protection from the incoming fire that chipped away at its armor like a sculptor working stone. "Some orders shouldn't be followed," he said finally, his voice calm and certain, carrying the quiet conviction of a man who had found the bedrock of his principles and would not be moved from it. "Call it in. I'm engaging." What followed became the stuff of military legend, though few outside the special operations community would ever hear the true story. 8 shots in under 2 minutes, each one finding its mark with devastating precision that bordered on the supernatural. 8 insurgents neutralized, their threat ended before they understood what was happening, before they could locate the source of the death that reached out from nearly half a mile away with perfect, terrible accuracy. The Marine platoon, freed from the crossfire that had held them, evacuated their wounded and retreated to safety. 13 men made it home because Marcus Harper decided that saving lives mattered more than following orders from a man safe in a command center miles away from the smell of cordite and blood. When Harper and Pierce returned to base 3 hours later, they found Captain Richard Thornton waiting for them in the operations center. His face was twisted with fury, red with an anger that seemed to vibrate in the air around him like heat shimmer off desert sand. "You disobeyed a direct order, Lieutenant," Thornton snarled, his voice loud enough to carry through the operations center, ensuring everyone present would witness Harper's humiliation. "I expressly told you to hold position." Harper stood at attention, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts, his body language that of a subordinate accepting judgment from a superior officer. "With respect, sir, those Marines would have died if we hadn't acted." "That wasn't your call to make," Thornton shouted, slamming his hand on the desk hard enough to make the maps jump. "This isn't about those Marines. This is about the chain of command. This is about discipline. This is about you thinking you know better than your commanding officer." What Harper didn't know then, what he wouldn't discover until much later, when whispered conversations in dark corners finally revealed. The truth was that Thornton had already begun rewriting the narrative. In his official report, Thornton claimed he had authorized the engagement after careful analysis of the tactical situation, presenting himself as the decisive commander who had saved the Marine platoon through bold action and tactical brilliance. Harper's role was minimized to that of a trigger puller, simply following orders, a skilled marksman certainly, but merely an instrument of Thornton's superior strategic vision. The 8 kills were attributed to command-level decision-making rather than the extraordinary marksmanship and moral courage of the man who had actually taken the shots. The Marines told a different story, of course. They reported that Harper's intervention had saved their lives when no other help was forthcoming, when their calls for support had been met with silence and bureaucratic delays that felt like death sentences delivered in military jargon. But their statements were quietly buried, deemed inconsistent with official records by Thornton's superiors, who had no reason to doubt the word of a respected officer over the confused recollections of combat-stressed Marines who couldn't possibly understand the complexity of command decisions made under pressure. The aftermath was as swift as it was unjust. Thornton received a Silver Star and promotion for his quick thinking and decisive leadership. Harper received a formal reprimand for failing to properly document engagement protocols, a minor infraction, but enough to stall his career for years, to mark him as a soldier who didn't quite understand how the system worked, who let emotion override proper procedure. Pierce had urged Harper to fight back, to tell the truth about what happened, to bring the Marines' statements to light, and expose Thornton's theft of valor for what it was. But Harper, ever the idealist who believed the mission mattered more than personal recognition, had refused. The mission succeeded, he'd said simply, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that would define his entire career. Those Marines made it home. That's what matters, not medals, not promotions, not setting the record straight. So Harper had kept his silence, accepting the reprimand with stoic dignity, swallowing the bitter pill of injustice because he believed that some things were more important than personal vindication. He'd continued serving with distinction, eventually rebuilding his reputation through sheer excellence in the field, through a level of skill that could not be denied or diminished even by men who wanted to bury his achievements. But he'd kept meticulous records of everything: dates, times, locations, radio transcripts, witness statements, all carefully documented in the journal his daughter now carried. The truth preserved in ink and paper, waiting for the day when it would matter, when someone would care enough to read it and understand what had really happened in Fallujah, when a young lieutenant chose conscience over career. At the firing line, Eva stood quietly as Sergeant Miller explained the rules of the challenge. The weight of history pressed down on this moment, her father's legacy. Thornton's theft, 3 years of preparation. Everything Marcus Harper had taught her, everything he had documented in those journals, would be tested in the next 10 shots. "Standard qualification protocol," Miller told her, kneeling slightly so he was closer to her eye level. 10 rounds target at 500 meters. 3 hits on the silhouette would be considered minimally qualifying for a Special Forces candidate. He hesitated, then added more gently, his eyes showing the concern his official voice couldn't express. "That's a very difficult standard, young lady. No one would think less of you if you reconsidered this challenge." Ava looked up at him, her blue eyes calm and focused, carrying a maturity that seemed wrong in someone so young. "I'm ready, Sergeant." Miller nodded, respecting her determination, if not her chances of success. He gestured to the weapon rack where several M24 sniper rifles waited, their stocks gleaming with oil, their barrels testament to American precision engineering. "You'll need to select a rifle." Eva walked to the rack, her eyes scanning the available options with the practiced assessment of someone who had done this before. After a moment's consideration, she selected an M24, the same model her father had carried in Fallujah, the same one she had trained with under his patient guidance during weekend trips to civilian ranges, where a father could teach his daughter the skills that had kept him alive through 2 decades of war. The rifle was almost as long as she was tall, designed for adult male operators who averaged 6 feet and 180 pounds, not 12-year-old girls, who barely cleared 5 feet and weighed 90 pounds soaking wet. Several of the younger soldiers exchanged skeptical glances, a few smirking openly at the sight of the small girl with the oversized weapon, already writing the punchline to a joke they would tell later in the barracks. Thornton watched with poorly concealed satisfaction, clearly anticipating her embarrassment, already planning the words he would use to send her away when she failed. "You might want to start with something smaller," he called out, his voice carrying false concern that barely masked his anticipation of her failure. That rifle has quite a kick. Might break your collarbone if you're not careful. Eva ignored him completely, carrying the M24 to the firing position with practiced ease that surprised several of the watching operators. Her movements as she set up were methodical and precise, the kind of ritual efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions of muscle memory built through hours of practice. She laid out the ammunition with careful spacing, checked the barrel for obstructions with a practiced eye, adjusted the bipod legs to the perfect height for her prone position. Each movement deliberate, considered the actions of someone who understood that preparation was half the battle. Pierce watched from the sidelines, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes missing nothing. He noted the perfect form as Eva settled into position behind the rifle, her body aligned properly with the target, in a way that couldn't be faked or improvised. The cheek weld secure against the stock, the breathing controlled, and even the stillness that came to her small frame like a meditation. These weren't things a novice would know, he reflected. These were fundamentals that separated professionals from amateurs, skills that took years to develop, habits drilled so deeply they became automatic even under stress. Thornton stepped closer, his shadow falling across Eva as she prepared a deliberate intimidation tactic he had used on countless soldiers over the years. When he spoke, his voice was pitched low, meant for her ears alone, designed to shake her confidence in these final moments before she proved or disproved her claim to her father's legacy. "I knew your father, girl," he said, his voice carrying ugly undertones. "He was reckless, insubordinate, the kind of man who got himself killed because he wouldn't follow orders. Syria wasn't bad luck. It was the inevitable result of poor judgment and an inflated sense of his own importance." Eva's hands paused momentarily on the rifle, the only sign that his words had landed. But her face revealed nothing of her thoughts, no anger or hurt breaking through the calm that seemed as much a part of her as her blonde hair and blue eyes. She continued her preparations, working the bolt to ensure smooth operation, checking the magazine, adjusting the scope with small, precise movements that spoke of deep familiarity with the weapon system. "You have no business being here." Thornton continued, pressing his psychological advantage like a knife against a pressure point. "This isn't some game. These men have trained for years to earn the right to be on this range. When you fail, and you will fail, you'll understand why children don't belong in places where warriors work." When Eva finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the range with surprising force. "My father earned a Medal of Honor on your watch, Colonel. He died saving his men while waiting for support that never came." She looked up at him, then her young face solemn and knowing. "I think we both know why that was." Thornton's face hardened, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his calculated intimidation. His hand clenched at his side, but before he could respond, Sergeant Miller intervened with the timing of a man who recognized danger when he saw it. "Sir, we're ready to proceed with the qualification test." Thornton stepped back, his composure quickly restored, the mask of professional authority sliding back into place like a visor dropping before battle. "By all means, Sergeant. Let's get this over with." Miller turned to Eva, his expression carefully neutral. 10 rounds, 500 meters, whenever you're ready, Miss Harper." Eva nodded and turned her full attention to the task at hand, the world narrowing to just her, the rifle and the distant target that waited 500 meters downrange. She settled behind the M24, her small body finding the correct position with practiced ease that made several of the watching operators exchange surprised glances. The rifle was heavy, designed for men twice her size and 3 times her strength, but she positioned it with practiced efficiency, her muscles remembering the countless hours her father had spent teaching her how to work with the weapon rather than against it, how to let physics and proper form do the work that raw strength alone could never accomplish. The range fell scent as Eva prepared for her first shot, even the skeptics watching now, with genuine curiosity to see how this unusual scenario would play out. The old guard veterans stood particularly still, their weathered faces revealing nothing of their thoughts, but their attention absolute. Eva's world narrowed to the fundamentals her father had drilled into her since she was 6 years old. The lessons that had started as a game between father and daughter and evolved into something deeper. A connection that transcended the ordinary relationships of peacetime families, who never had to worry about overseas deployments and casualty notification officers appearing at their doors with folded flags and terrible news. Body position, check. Straight line from shoulder to hip, minimal contact points with the ground. Let the earth support you without restricting your breathing. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, patient and instructive, teaching her to become one with the weapon and the ground beneath her. Breath control. Steady. 4 seconds in hold at the natural pause, 4 seconds out, finding the rhythm that would carry her through the shots to come. Not forcing it, not fighting her body's natural cadence, but working with it the way water flows around stones in a river. Sight picture. Clear. The crosshairs settling on the distant silhouette with the certainty of planets falling into orbit. The slight wobble as her body made microscopic adjustments, then the stillness as everything aligned. Wind calculation. Moderate. A slight breeze from her 2 o'clock, maybe 3 miles per hour, enough to matter at this distance, but not enough to require major adjustment. Her father had taught her to read wind not just by feel but by observing grass movement. Dust patterns, the subtle shift of mirage. She drew a slow breath, held it gently at the natural pause before exhalation, and found that perfect space between heartbeats that her father had taught her to recognize. That moment of absolute stillness where nothing exists but the perfect alignment of eye, scope, and target. That instant when the body achieves a stillness so complete it feels like becoming part of the earth itself. Her fingers squeezed the trigger with smooth, even pressure. No jerking, no anticipation, just the gradual increase of force. Until the rifle fired almost as a surprise, the recoil absorbed by her positioned body exactly as her father had taught her, exactly as she had practiced 1,000 times under his patient guidance. The M24 barked its report, echoing across the range. Eva absorbed the recoil smoothly, her small frame rolling with the force rather than fighting it, then quickly realigned for her second shot with the efficiency of someone for whom this was as natural as breathing. She worked the bolt with practiced precision, chambering the next round. The metallic sound of the action cycling was music to those who understood rifles, a mechanical symphony of parts working in perfect harmony. Another breath, another moment of perfect stillness, another shot delivered with mechanical precision. 9 more times she repeated the process, her movements becoming almost meditative in their rhythm. Each shot delivered with the same methodical precision, each one followed by the efficient manipulation of the bolt to chamber the next round, the muscle memory so deep that her hands seemed to work independently of conscious thought. The watching operators began to notice details. The consistency of her cheek weld never shifting position between shots. The controlled breathing that remained steady even after the recoil. The way she seemed to enter a state of focused calm that experienced shooters recognized as the zone, that place where conscious thought faded and pure execution took over. When the last shot had been fired and the range fell silent once more, Eva sat up slowly. She engaged the safety on the rifle before setting it down carefully, exactly as her father had taught her, treating the weapon with the respect due to a tool that could kill with perfect efficiency. She looked toward Sergeant Miller, waiting for the results with the same calm patience she had shown throughout, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. Miller lowered his spotting scope, his face carefully neutral as he turned to Colonel Thornton. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of surprise that he couldn't quite suppress, a crack in his professional facade that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read such things. "Would you like to verify the target yourself, sir?" Thornton nodded stiffly, taking the offered spotting scope with hands that were perhaps not quite as steady as they had been before. As he focused on the distant target, the assembled soldiers watched his face, looking for some reaction to what he saw, some confirmation of their growing suspicion that something extraordinary had just occurred. For several long moments, Thornton said nothing. He adjusted the focus on the scope as if not believing what he was seeing, as if expecting the image to change if he looked at it from a different angle or with different magnification. His knuckles whitened on the scope's body, his jaw worked silently. When he finally lowered the scope, his expression was thunderous, his face dark with an emotion that might have been rage or might have been something closer to fear. "This is impossible," he said flatly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The target must have been pre-marked. Someone tampered with it." Miller looked uncomfortable, a decent man being asked to participate in a lie that his conscience wouldn't allow. "Sir, I personally set up a fresh target before the test. There was no opportunity for tampering. I was in visual contact with it the entire time." "Then check it again." Thornton snapped, his voice rising with the edge of desperation that came to men watching their certainties crumble. "Verify it up close. There has to be an explanation." One of the old guard veterans stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered. A tall, lean man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in harsh conditions, his eyes carrying the particular clarity that came to men who had seen too much death to be impressed by rank or intimidated by anger. The silver in his hair caught the morning light, and the set of his shoulders spoke of command authority that didn't retire just because a man took off the uniform. "I'll verify it," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of long command. "I believe we'd all appreciate an objective assessment from someone without a stake in the outcome." Thornton hesitated, clearly recognizing the man and understanding that refusing his offer would look worse than accepting it. His eyes narrowed as he calculated the risks, measured the political cost of appearing to obstruct an independent verification. After a moment, he nodded curtly, the gesture of a man who knew he had already lost but couldn't quite admit it yet. "Fine. Sergeant Wilson can confirm." The veteran, apparently Wilson, though his bearing suggested he'd held much higher rank before retirement, took the spotting scope and studied the distant target with the methodical care of a man who understood that accuracy mattered, that truth was worth taking the time to verify. He made small adjustments to the focus, examined the target from multiple angles, took his time in a way that suggested he would not be rushed into hasty conclusions. After a thorough examination that seemed to stretch for minutes, he lowered the scope and turned to address the assembled men, his voice pitched to carry across the hushed range with the practiced projection of someone who had spent years giving commands in combat environments. 10 shots, 10 hits. He paused, letting that sink in, watching the ripple of reaction spread through the crowd like rings expanding from a stone dropped in still water. All within the center mass, grouping tighter than I've seen from most qualified snipers with years of experience. He turned to Eva, giving her a respectful nod that carried more weight than a chest full of medals, the kind of acknowledgement that came from one professional to another regardless of age or circumstance. "Exceptional shooting, Miss Harper. Your father would be extraordinarily proud." A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers like wind through grass, starting low and building in volume as the implications sank in. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't dismiss the assessment of a veteran like Wilson, couldn't explain away a performance that defied every assumption they'd held about what a 12-year-old girl could possibly accomplish. Several of the younger operators looked at Eva with newfound respect, their earlier smirks replaced by expressions of genuine amazement that bordered on disbelief. Thornton's face had gone rigid, a muscle working in his jaw as he struggled to maintain his composure, to hold on to the authority that was slipping through his fingers like water through a sieve. "This proves nothing," he said tightly, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man watching carefully constructed lies begin to crumble. "Anyone can get lucky once. It doesn't mean—" "That wasn't luck, Colonel," Pierce said, finally stepping forward from the sidelines where he had watched the entire drama unfold with the patience of a man who had waited 3 years for this moment. "That was skill. The same skill her father had, the skill you've spent 20 years trying to diminish because it reminded you of your own mediocrity." A hush fell over the range as Pierce walked slowly toward Thornton, closing the distance with measured steps. Though 70 years old now, Sergeant Major Roland Pierce still moved with the deadly grace of the warrior he had been, the kind of economy of motion that came to men who had survived decades of combat through skill rather than luck. His eyes set deep in a face weathered by decades of sun and combat never left Thornton's face. "Frank!" Thornton said, his voice carefully controlled, pitched to sound casual despite the tension that crackled in the air between them like static electricity before a lightning strike. "I didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd retired to Montana." "I did," Pierce agreed, stopping a few paces from Thornton. His posture relaxed, but his eyes hard as flint, "until I got a call 3 years ago about Marcus Harper dying while waiting for support that never came." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with implication weighted with years of suppressed truth. "Funny how history repeats itself, isn't it, Richard?" Thornton's face flushed, color rising in his cheeks like flags of anger or perhaps shame. "You're out of line, Pierce. You have no business on this range. None of you do," he added, looking around at the gathered veterans who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd. "This is an active military facility, not a retirement home reunion." Pierce smiled thinly, the expression carrying no warmth whatsoever. "We were invited by Captain Hernandez, the same officer who approved Eva's range time. Seems he thought this might be an event worth witnessing, worth documenting. Captain Hernandez has exceeded his authority." Thornton snapped, his voice rising with each word. "And you're interfering with official training operations." "No, sir," Miller interjected respectfully but firmly, a man who had found his moral line and would not be moved from it. "The qualification round is complete. The range is currently clear." He glanced at Eva, then back to Thornton, something like pride creeping into his voice despite his efforts to maintain neutrality. "And according to the terms you set, Miss Harper has more than met the qualification standard. She exceeded it significantly." Thornton turned to Eva, who stood quietly watching the confrontation unfold around her like a storm she had known was coming and had prepared for. His eyes were cold with barely suppressed fury, with the rage of a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to fracture. "You think this changes anything, girl? You think hitting a paper target makes you special, makes you worthy of your father's name?" "No, sir," Eva replied calmly, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her 12 years should allow. "What makes me special is knowing the truth about what happened to my father, and having proof." She held up the journal she'd brought with her, her father's mission log with its detailed records of dates, times, radio transcripts, and witness statements. The truth preserved in ink and paper, waiting 3 years for this moment. "My father documented everything, Colonel." Eva continued, her young voice steady and clear, cutting through the morning air with the precision of the shots she had just fired. "Including your refusal to send air support when his team was ambushed in Syria. Including the 37 minutes they waited while you decided whether saving their lives was worth the risk to your career." The assembled soldiers went utterly still, the accusation hanging in the air, like the report of a rifle shot echoing across empty canyons. Thornton stared at Eva, then at the journal, his face paling slightly before his training reasserted itself. The decades of practice at maintaining composure under pressure, clicking into place like armor plates locking together. "That's classified information," he said coldly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who still believed rank could override truth. "And even if it weren't, the ramblings in a personal journal hardly constitute evidence of anything except a grieving man's confusion in his final days." "Perhaps not on their own," Pierce agreed, his voice calm but carrying an edge like a blade fresh from the whetstone. "But combined with the testimony of the Delta operators who survived that day, and the radio logs that mysteriously disappeared from official records but were backed up by the communications officer who suspected something was wrong." He smiled thinly. "That might be enough to warrant an investigation. Don't you think, Colonel?" Thornton looked around, suddenly aware of how the situation had shifted. How what had begun as an opportunity to humiliate a presumptuous child had somehow transformed into something far more dangerous. The old guard veterans were watching him with knowing eyes, their weathered feeds revealing nothing but their attention absolute, like predators watching prey that had finally stumbled into the trap. The younger operators were looking confused, uncertain, wondering what truth lay behind these accusations that hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "This is absurd," Thornton said, fighting to regain control of the narrative, to reassert the authority that had served him for 3 decades. "You have no authority here, Pierce. None of you do. And dragging a child into your conspiracy theories is beneath even you." "I'm not a child," Eva said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through the tension with the clarity of a bell. "I'm Master Sergeant Marcus Harper's daughter, and I made a promise at his grave that I would restore his honor and expose the truth about how he died." She stepped forward, facing Thornton directly despite being less than half his size, her blue eyes meeting his without fear or hesitation. "My father taught me that a soldier's greatest duty isn't to follow orders blindly. It's to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He died living by that principle." She held up the journal again, its worn cover testament to how many times it had been opened, how many times she had read her father's words preparing for this moment. "And I have proof that you left him to die because of a 20-year grudge over Fallujah, because he was better than you and you couldn't stand it." Thornton's composure finally cracked, anger breaking through like water through a failing dam. "You know nothing about Fallujah," he snapped, his voice rising, all pretense of professional calm abandoned. "Nothing about command decisions or the responsibilities of leadership that come with rank and experience. I know that my father saved 8 Marines that day while you sat safely in the command center." Eva replied, her voice still calm, still steady, speaking truth, with the certainty of someone who had studied the evidence until it was carved into her memory. "I know you took credit for his actions and had him reprimanded when the Marines tried to tell the truth. I know you stole his valor because your ego couldn't handle being shown up by a better man." A deadly silence fell over the range like snow, muffling everything, making the moment feel suspended in time. Thornton looked around, seeing the changing expressions on the faces of his men as they processed this information, as the accusations gave context to rumors they might have heard, questions they might have wondered about but never dared to ask. The implications were clear. If what the girl said was true, if Thornton had indeed stolen credit in Fallujah and then allowed Marcus Harper to die in Syria out of spite, it wasn't just a matter of career-ending disgrace. It was potential criminal charges, court-martial imprisonment, the destruction of everything he had built over 3 decades of service. "This is insubordination," he said tightly, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. "Sergeant Miller, clear the range. Everyone back to their duties. This exhibition is over." Miller hesitated, looking from Thornton to Eva to the assembled veterans, understanding that he stood at a moral crossroads that would define his own integrity. "Sir, about Miss Harper's range qualification." "To hell with her qualification," Thornton snarled, all pretense of professional courtesy abandoned in his desperation to end this situation before it spiraled further out of his control. "This entire exercise was a mistake. I'm ordering this range closed for the remainder of the day." Eva stood her ground, unflinching despite Thornton's outburst, her small frame somehow conveying more strength than his towering presence. "We had a deal, Colonel. I hit the targets, more than 3 of them. You promised to sign my range permission." "And I'm revoking that promise," Thornton said coldly, his voice hard as iron. "This range is for military personnel only, not for children with delusions of grandeur and old men with grudges who can't let the past stay buried where it belongs." Pierce stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried more threat than shouting ever could. "Be careful, Richard. There are a lot of witnesses here today, a lot of phones recording every word you say, every decision you make." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward several of the younger operators whose hands were indeed hovering near their pockets, whose expressions suggested they had been capturing this entire confrontation on devices that would upload to the internet before Thornton could even begin to control the narrative. Do you really want to be seen refusing range access to the daughter of a Medal of Honor recipient on the anniversary of his death? Pierce continued, his voice still quiet but carrying perfect clarity, especially after she just outshot most of your qualified snipers. Especially when questions are already being asked about what really happened in Syria. Thornton glared at Pierce, then at the surrounding soldiers, many of whom did indeed have phones partially concealed in their hands, recording everything for an audience that would number in the millions by nightfall. The political calculus was obvious, written in the mathematics of social media and public opinion, that could destroy careers faster than any official investigation. Denying Eva now, after her impressive performance after the accusations she had made, would look petty and vindictive. It would raise questions about why he was so determined to keep her away from the range questions that might lead to uncomfortable investigations into matters he had worked 20 years to keep buried. For a long moment, the outcome hung in the balance, the assembled crowd holding its collective breath. Then Thornton's training reasserted itself. The political instinct that had helped him rise through the ranks despite his mediocrity, the ability to recognize when retreat was the only option that wouldn't result in complete destruction. He forced a thin smile, the expression looking painful on his face. "Very well," he said, his voice artificially pleasant in a way that fooled no one. "Miss Harper has indeed demonstrated remarkable proficiency. Sergeant Miller, please process her range permission as discussed." He looked directly at Eva, his eyes cold despite his smile promising that this was far from over. "Congratulations, young lady. It seems you inherited your father's talents, if not his judgment. I look forward to seeing what you do with such gifts." Eva held his gaze steadily, neither celebrating her victory nor acknowledging his barely concealed threat. "Thank you, Colonel. I look forward to using the range regularly to honor my father's memory and continue the training he started." Thornton nodded stiffly, then turned to his aide with barely controlled fury evident in every line of his body. "I have meetings to attend. Handle this situation." Without another word, he strode away from the range, his back rigid with suppressed anger, leaving behind a crowd of soldiers who would spend the rest of the day discussing what they had just witnessed, posting videos that would be viewed millions of times, sharing a story that would spread through military communities like wildfire through dry grass. As Thornton disappeared from view, a subtle release of tension rippled through the assembled soldiers like a wave receding from shore. Several of the old guard veterans approached Eva, offering quiet words of congratulation and respect that carried the weight of men who had seen combat and knew courage when they witnessed it, regardless of the age or size of the person demonstrating it. Pierce stood beside her, a protective presence, as she accepted their acknowledgments with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout the confrontation. When they had a moment alone, he spoke quietly, his weathered face serious. "That was only the first step," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Thornton won't forget this. He won't forgive it either. Men like him never do." Eva nodded, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. "I know, but now everyone else knows too. They saw what I can do. They heard what I said about my father. They watched Thornton refuse to deny it." She looked up at Pierce, her blue eyes clear and determined. "And next time I'm going to break my father's record. Right here where everyone can see. Where Thornton can't hide from the truth anymore." Pierce studied her face, seeing in it the same quiet determination that had defined Marcus Harper. The same unshakable moral compass that had led him to disobey orders in Fallujah, and would eventually cost him his life in Syria. The same courage that couldn't be taught or faked, only inherited and refined through love and loss. "Your father once told me you'd break every record he ever set," Pierce said softly. "I'm starting to believe he was right. About that and about a lot of things." Eva looked down at the Medal of Honor in the frame she still carried, her father's, when looking back at her from the photograph with the quiet pride of a man who had lived and died according to principles that transcended personal ambition or self-preservation. "I made a promise, Sergeant Major, at Arlington 3 years ago today. I promised him I'd restore his honor and show everyone the truth about what happened." She looked up at the distant target she had just shot with such extraordinary precision, then back at Pierce. And today was just the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the morning Eva Harper stood on Fort Bragg's firing range and transformed Colonel Richard Thornton's intended humiliation into her own vindication. 3 weeks during which the video of her performance had escaped the confines of the military base and spread across the internet with the unstoppable momentum of truth that had been suppressed too long. The footage captured on a dozen smartphones by soldiers who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary had been viewed more than 7 million times. Major news networks picked up the story, fascinated by the narrative of a 12-year-old girl honoring her fallen father through superhuman marksmanship. CNN ran a feature segment. Fox News brought in retired special operations personnel to analyze her technique frame by frame. What we're seeing here is genuinely extraordinary. A former Navy SEAL told a primetime audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in the precision shooting community. This level of marksmanship typically requires not just years of training, but a kind of intuitive understanding of ballistics that simply cannot be taught. It has to be innate, then refined through thousands of hours of practice. The commentator leaned forward, pointing to frozen frames of Eva's shooting position. Notice her body alignment, the consistency of her cheek weld, the smooth manipulation of the bolt between shots. These are fundamentals that take most snipers years to master. She's executing them with the precision of a seasoned professional. Inside his wood-paneled office at Fort Bragg, Colonel Thornton watched the segment with barely controlled fury, his jaw clenched so tight that veins stood out on his temples like rivers on a topographical map. His legal advisor, Major Phillips, stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral as he delivered news that would make the situation exponentially worse. "Sir, we've received another range request from Miss Harper." Phillips placed a folder on Thornton's desk with the careful precision of a man handling explosives. "She's requesting access to the SFAMC." Thornton's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing with dangerous focus. "The Special Forces Advanced Marksmanship Center. That facility is reserved for our most elite operators. The suggestion is absurd." "She's citing the precedent established by her previous approvals, sir." Phillips continued, his voice maintaining professional neutrality despite the tension crackling through the office like electricity. "And the request has accumulated endorsements from several retired special operations personnel, including Sergeant Major Pierce and others who witnessed her initial demonstration." Phillips opened the folder, revealing a stack of supporting letters that seemed to mock Thornton's authority with their very existence. "Additionally, sir, given the media attention surrounding Miss Harper, denying this request might generate the kind of public scrutiny that—" "I'm aware of the political considerations, Major." Thornton interrupted, his voice tight with suppressed rage. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the base, his hands clasped behind his back with military precision that couldn't quite hide the tension vibrating through his frame. For a long moment he was silent, staring out at the sprawling complex of buildings and training facilities that represented his domain. His carefully constructed kingdom built on lies that a 12-year-old girl was threatening to expose to the harsh light of truth. "How many endorsements?" he asked finally. 17, sir. All from retired Special Forces personnel with distinguished service records. Several served with Master Sergeant Harper in various capacities." Thornton's reflection in the window showed a face carved from granite eyes, cold with calculation. A thin smile slowly spread across his features, though it carried no warmth whatsoever. Only the predatory satisfaction of a man who had just seen an opportunity disguised as a threat. "Approve it," he said quietly. Phillips blinked in surprise, his professional composure momentarily cracked. "Sir, approve the request, Major," Thornton repeated, turning from the window to face his advisor. "But I want the SFAMC course reconfigured to maximum difficulty. Variable wind conditions, reduced target exposure times, the full combat simulation protocol we use for our most advanced training." Understanding dawned in Phillips's eyes, followed quickly by concern. "Sir, that's the protocol we use to challenge operators with years of experience. For a 12-year-old, even one with demonstrated skill. If Miss Harper wants to play with the professionals," Thornton interrupted, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a trap being set. "Let's see how she handles real pressure. Let's see if her father's genetics hold up when the difficulty matches actual combat conditions." The smile never reached his eyes as he continued. "And schedule it for a time when I can personally oversee the assessment. I want to be there to ensure everything is conducted with absolute professionalism and adherence to our highest standards." Phillips nodded slowly, recognizing the strategy but clearly uncomfortable with using military training facilities to engineer a child's public failure. "Yes, sir. I'll process the approval and coordinate the scheduling." After Phillips departed, Thornton unlocked his desk drawer and removed a thick file marked with classification stamps and warning labels about unauthorized disclosure. Inside were mission reports from Syria, carefully sanitized before submission to the Pentagon, each page a testament to the art of selective truth-telling. He flipped through the pages until he found what he sought. The transcript of Marcus Harper's final transmission, the words he had read 1,000 times in the 3 years since that day. The entry included the full text of Harper's final call for support. The desperate plea that Thornton had let go unanswered for 37 minutes. Thornton closed the file, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Some ghosts refused to stay buried, he reflected. But he had survived worse than the accusation of a child and the suspicions of retired soldiers who no longer held any real power. A 12-year-old girl and a handful of aging veterans were not going to destroy the career he had built brick by careful brick, regardless of what they thought they knew or could prove. He would let Eva Harper have her moment at the SFAMC. Let her attempt the advanced course under conditions that would challenge operators with a decade of experience. And when she failed, as she inevitably must, the viral enthusiasm would collapse. The questions would fade. The investigation that General Aldridge was surely considering would lose its momentum, starved of the public interest that gave it urgency. Some problems, Thornton had learned, solved themselves if you simply created the right conditions and waited with patience. In the modest ranch-style home where Eva lived with her grandparents just outside Fort Bragg's main gate, the kitchen table had been transformed into a command center. Eva sat surrounded by her father's journals, their pages filled with Marcus Harper's precise handwriting, documenting everything from basic marksmanship principles to advanced ballistic calculations that would challenge a physics professor. Pierce sat across from her, his weathered hands cradling a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten in the intensity of their discussion. Several other members of the old guard had gathered, men whose combined combat experience spanned 6 decades and a dozen conflicts, each one a library of tactical knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual. "Here it is," Eva said, her finger tracing a passage in a journal dated from her father's deployment to Afghanistan in 2018. The day before Syria, Dad sent a secure transmission directly to Colonel Thornton. A warning about intelligence indicating a possible ambush at the insertion point. Pierce leaned closer, reading the entry with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered, that the difference between truth and lie often lived in the spaces between words. Harper had documented everything with the meticulous precision of a man who knew he was creating a record that might outlive him, that might one day be the only voice speaking truth, when his own had been silenced. The entry included timestamps, message reference numbers, even the specific encryption protocol used. It described in detail how the human sources had reported enemy movement patterns inconsistent with the official intelligence briefing, how local informants had warned of unusual activity around the planned insertion zone, how every indicator suggested walking into a prepared ambush rather than a routine extraction operation. He knew, Pierce said quietly, the weight of confirmation heavy in his voice, like lead settling in water. Thornton knew they were walking into a trap and sent them anyway. Eva nodded, her young face solemn beyond her years. And when Dad called for emergency support, Thornton delayed responding for 37 minutes. She tapped another page where Harper had documented previous response times for similar requests, building a pattern of evidence that made the Syria delay stand out like blood on snow. The standard protocol required response within 5 minutes maximum. Even in complex tactical situations, 10 minutes was considered the outside limit. Grayson Mallory, the former intelligence officer, studied the documentation with professional appreciation for thoroughness. His gray eyes, still sharp despite his years, moved across the pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a career analyzing classified information. "This is solid evidence, Eva, but Thornton will claim the journals are just personal records, not official documentation. He'll argue they represent Harper's subjective interpretation rather than objective fact." "That's why we need more," Eva replied, her voice carrying a determination that reminded every man in the room of her father. "We need witnesses. We need the communications logs that Thornton buried. And we need people to see that I can do what Dad could do, so they'll believe what he wrote." She looked up at Pierce, her blue eyes clear with purpose. "That's why I requested access to the SFAMC. If I can perform there at the highest level in front of witnesses who understand what it means, it validates everything. Dad always said performance builds credibility." Pierce smiled slightly, recognizing Marcus Harper's tactical thinking in his daughter's strategy. "You know Thornton will make it as difficult as possible. The SFAMC is where the best of the best are tested. Experienced operators have failed there. He'll configure the course to ensure you can't succeed." "That's what I'm counting on," Eva said calmly. "He'll try to make me fail in front of everyone. But when I succeed instead, when I perform under the worst conditions he can create, it proves that Dad's training was real, that his methods work, that everything in these journals comes from a genuine master of the craft, not a delusional man exaggerating his own abilities." Pierce nodded, slowly understanding the deeper strategy at work. "You're using his ego against him, just like your father would have done." A slight smile touched Eva's lips, the first genuine expression of pleasure any of them had seen since this campaign began. "I had a good teacher, Sergeant Major, the best." William Sutton, a grizzled veteran who had served with Marcus in Iraq, leaned forward with concern written across his scarred face. His hands, gnarled from years of hard use, gripped the edge of the table. "But Eva, the SFAMC isn't just about marksmanship. It's about performing under pressure that simulates real combat. Moving targets, variable conditions, time constraints that force decisions in fractions of seconds. Even if you have your father's talent, you're still 12 years old. The physical demands alone—" "I know what I'm doing," Eva interrupted gently but firmly. "Dad prepared me for exactly this kind of challenge. He knew that someday I might need to prove not just that I could shoot, but that I could shoot under the worst possible conditions." She opened another journal, this one filled with training logs from the past 3 years. Page after page documented practice sessions at civilian ranges, each one progressively more challenging, each one designed to simulate the kind of pressure she would face at a facility like the SFAMC. "Dad had me shooting in wind and rain," she explained, her finger tracing the entries. "In failing light and at dawn when the mirage effects are worst. He built remote-controlled moving targets and had me engage them with time limits. He taught me to shoot after physical exertion, after running until my heart rate was elevated and my breathing ragged." Pierce examined the logs with growing amazement. "He was preparing you for this 3 years ago, before Syria, before any of this started." "He told me once that the world wasn't fair," Eva said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "That people like Thornton existed in positions of power, and that the only way to beat them was to be so good, so undeniably excellent, that even their lies couldn't diminish the truth of what you accomplished." She closed the journal carefully. "So yes, Thornton will make it as difficult as possible at the SFAMC. But I've been training for difficult my entire life. That's what Dad taught me. Not to hope for easy conditions, but to be ready for the worst and excel anyway." James Donovan, the former combat medic whose steady hands had saved countless lives under fire, spoke up for the first time. The mental game is what separates good shooters from great ones at that level. Thornton will try to get in your head, use psychological pressure to break your focus. How do you plan to handle that? Eva met his gaze directly. By remembering why I'm doing this. Not for glory, not for recognition, but to restore Dad's honor and expose the truth. When you're shooting for something bigger than yourself, the pressure becomes fuel instead of burden. The approval came through official channels 48 hours later. Eva was granted access to the Special Forces Advanced Marksmanship Center for a demonstration shoot scheduled for 2 weeks out to allow for what the authorization letter called appropriate preparation and safety protocols. Reading between the lines, Pierce understood they were giving Thornton time to configure the course to maximum difficulty, time to stack the deck as thoroughly as possible. The old guard spent those 2 weeks putting Eva through a compressed training regimen that would have broken most adults. Each day before dawn, they gathered at a private range owned by one of the veterans, a sprawling piece of property in the pine forests outside Fort Bragg where they could train without observation or interference. Pierce supervised most of the sessions personally, though each veteran contributed their particular expertise. Mallory taught her to read terrain and wind patterns like a language, showing her how to detect air currents from grass movement and dust patterns invisible to untrained eyes. Sutton drilled her on weapon manipulation until the mechanical actions became so automatic she could perform them in her sleep, building muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. Donovan taught her breathing techniques to control stress responses and maintain focus when her body wanted to panic, methods he had learned treating wounded under fire. But mostly, Pierce let Eva work alone. She had asked for it, specifically understanding that when the moment came at the SFAMC, she would be isolated on the firing line with only her skills and her father's training to sustain her. The support and advice of the old guard was valuable, but the real preparation happened in the hours she spent by herself running through her father's journals, memorizing his Harper method until it became as natural as breathing. The method was elegant in its simplicity, but devastating in its effectiveness. 5 points that had to align perfectly for the perfect shot, 5 considerations that most shooters handled sequentially, but that her father had trained her to process simultaneously, like a musician hearing all the instruments in an orchestra at once rather than listening to them one at a time. Calculate the baseline trajectory, account for atmospheric conditions. Read the wind across the entire bullet path. Adjust for the Coriolis effect at extreme distances. Find the space between heartbeats where the body achieves perfect stillness. Each element required not just knowledge, but deep understanding, the kind of intuitive grasp that came from thousands of hours of practice. Her father had broken down each component into its constituent parts, teaching her the physics and mathematics behind ballistic performance, then rebuilding them into an integrated whole that she could execute without conscious thought. Eva practiced with modified rifles that Pierce and the others had carefully sabotaged, knowing that Thornton would almost certainly tamper with her equipment if given the opportunity. Heavy triggers that required twice the normal pressure, sticky bolts that caught and dragged, scopes with slightly misaligned reticles. Each imperfection designed to throw off a normal shooter, each one an opportunity for Eva to learn compensation and adaptation. Your father believed that perfect conditions were a myth, Pierce told her during one session, watching as she adjusted her point of aim to account for a scope that was deliberately 3 minutes of angle off center. He said that waiting for perfect was just another word for giving up. The real skill was performing despite imperfection, succeeding despite sabotage. Eva nodded her eye, never leaving the scope as she made microscopic adjustments to her aim, her young mind calculating the offset with mathematical precision. He used to say that every shot was a negotiation between what you wanted and what physics would allow. The shooter who understood that negotiation best was the one who won. The day before the SFAMC demonstration, Pierce found Eva alone at the range well after sunset, shooting by moonlight at targets she could barely see. He watched in silence for several minutes as she worked through a magazine, each shot fired after long moments of stillness, each one finding its mark despite conditions that would have made most shooters pack up and go home. "You should rest," he said, finally announcing his presence. "Tomorrow will be demanding enough without exhausting yourself tonight." Eva lowered the rifle and turned to face him, her young face ghostly pale in the moonlight. "I can't stop thinking about Dad's last transmission, the one from Syria. He must have known Thornton was going to delay the support, must have understood what that meant." Pierce moved closer, lowering himself carefully to sit beside her on the shooting mat. His old knees protested the movement, but he ignored the discomfort. "Your father was many things, Eva. Brilliant, courageous, principled to a fault, but he wasn't psychic. He couldn't have known for certain what Thornton would do." "But he suspected," Eva insisted, her voice tight with emotion she rarely showed. "He had to suspect. After Fallujah, after 20 years of Thornton's resentment and sabotage, he had to know that calling for support meant putting his life in Thornton's hands." Pierce was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with truths that were difficult to speak aloud. "Yes," he said finally. "I believe he suspected. And he called for support anyway because his men needed it, because saving them mattered more than protecting himself from Thornton's revenge." Eva's hands clenched on the rifle, her knuckles white, even in the dim moonlight. "That's not fair. That's not right." He shouldn't have had to choose between trusting his commander and protecting his team. "No, he shouldn't have," Pierce agreed quietly. "But the world your father lived in, the world all soldiers live in, isn't always fair or right. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes good men die because bad men have power they don't deserve." He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "What you're doing tomorrow at the SFAMC, what you've been doing since the moment you walked onto that range 3 weeks ago, is about making it right. Not fair because we can't bring your father back, can't undo what Thornton did, but right. True. Honest in a way that matters." Eva looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes but not falling, held back by the same iron will that had carried her through everything since her father's death. "What if I fail tomorrow? What if Thornton's sabotage works, or I just can't perform under that kind of pressure? Everything Dad taught me, everything he stood for, it all depends on me being good enough to prove it." "Your father's legacy doesn't depend on your performance tomorrow," Pierce said firmly. "It exists in the lives he saved in the Marines from Fallujah who went home because he chose conscience over career, and the Delta operators who survived Syria because he held off 18 attackers while they escaped. What you're doing is important, Eva, but it's not the foundation of who your father was. It's just making sure the world knows the truth about a man who deserves to be remembered accurately." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "And for what it's worth, I don't think you're going to fail tomorrow. I've watched you train for 3 weeks. I've seen you compensate for sabotaged equipment, perform under conditions that would challenge operators with decades of experience, maintain focus that would impress Zen masters. You're ready, Eva. More ready than Thornton understands or expects." Eva nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Dad used to say that confidence without competence was just arrogance, but competence without confidence was wasted potential." "Sounds like him," Pierce agreed with a slight smile. "So the question is, do you have both?" Eva was quiet for a moment, looking down at the rifle in her hands, the same model her father had carried in Fallujah and Iraq and Afghanistan, the tool he had used to save lives and serve his country despite being betrayed by the men he should have been able to trust. When she looked up, her eyes were clear, the tears gone, replaced by the kind of certainty that came from deep preparation meeting deeper purpose. "Yes," she said simply. "I have both." Pierce nodded, satisfied. "Then get some sleep, Eva Harper. Tomorrow you're going to show the world exactly what Marcus Harper's daughter can do." The Special Forces Advanced Marksmanship Center stood apart from the standard ranges at Fort Bragg, a state-of-the-art facility that represented the pinnacle of precision shooting technology and training methodology. Unlike the predictable conditions of basic qualification courses, the SFAMC was designed to simulate the chaos and unpredictability of actual combat environments, where enemies didn't stand still and wait to be shot, where weather changed without warning, where split-second decisions separated success from catastrophic failure. Variable winds generated by hidden fans could shift direction and intensity without warning. Targets appeared at random intervals and distances, some moving laterally or even charging toward the shooter position. Environmental factors could be adjusted mid-session, simulating everything from desert heat shimmer to mountain cold that affected ballistic performance. Lighting could shift from bright daylight to twilight gloom in seconds. It was a facility designed to break even the best snipers in the world, to force them beyond their comfort zones and test the limits of their adaptability and skill. It was where Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 operators came to prove they belonged among the elite. And today, a 12-year-old girl would attempt to demonstrate she deserved to stand among them. The morning air carried the first hint of winter's approach as Eva walked toward the facility, Pierce at her side, as always, his protective presence a constant she had learned to draw strength from. Behind them followed several members of the old guard retired warriors, who had made it their mission to ensure Eva had a fair chance to prove herself, witnesses who could testify to what they saw, regardless of how Thornton might try to spin the narrative. "Remember," Pierce said quietly as they neared the entrance, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Thornton agreed to this under pressure. He's expecting you to fail, probably has planned for it. Change the conditions, maybe tampered with the equipment again. Everything we practiced for, but amplified." Eva nodded, her face composed in the way that had become familiar over the past weeks, that preternatural calm that seemed wrong in someone so young, but perfect for the task ahead. "I know. He'll have made it as difficult as possible. That's fine. Dad always said to prepare for the worst conditions you can imagine, then add rain." Pierce smiled slightly at the quote, one of Marcus Harper's favorite training maxims. "Smart man, your father. Paranoid but smart." At the entrance, they were met by Sergeant Miller, the rangemaster, who had overseen Eva's first demonstration. His face remained carefully neutral, but his eyes held a hint of respect as he greeted them with a professional nod. "Miss Harper," he said formally, "you and your observers are expected." He glanced at Pierce and the old guard veterans, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts about this unusual gathering. "Colonel Thornton is waiting inside." "Thank you, Sergeant Miller," Eva replied politely, her voice steady despite the butterflies that surely must be rioting in her stomach. Inside the advanced marksmanship facility was a marvel of military engineering and tactical design. The main shooting area was twice the size of a standard range, with multiple firing positions arranged along a curved line that allowed shooters to engage targets across a variety of angles and elevations. The target area beyond featured complex terrain of artificial hill structures and vegetation that could be reconfigured to simulate environments from urban streets to mountain passes. Sophisticated electronic systems controlled everything from target presentation to environmental conditions. All operated from a climate-controlled booth that overlooked the entire facility like a control tower overlooking an airport. It was from this booth that courses could be designed to challenge the absolute limits of human marksmanship, where scenarios could be created that tested not just shooting skill, but decision-making, stress management, and tactical awareness. Colonel Thornton stood at the center of the facility, surrounded by a group of officers and special operators who represented the cream of America's military elite. Eva recognized the distinctive insignia of Navy SEALs and Delta Force. Among them, the most lethal warriors the nation produced, men who had earned their reputations through actions that would never be fully declassified in places that officially didn't exist, against enemies whose deaths would never be publicly acknowledged. They turned as one when Eva entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled skepticism. A 12-year-old girl in their world was an anomaly, something that didn't fit their experience or their expectations. Some had clearly seen the viral videos and come to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Others Eva suspected had been ordered to attend by Thornton, brought here to witness what he expected would be her humiliation and the death of her viral momentum. "Ah, Miss Harper," Thornton said, his voice carrying across the space with practiced authority. "Welcome to the Special Forces Advanced Marksmanship Center. Quite different from the basic range you shot on before, isn't it?" Eva surveyed the facility with calm eyes, taking in the sophisticated equipment, the complex terrain, the challenging geometry of angles and distances. "It's impressive, sir," she said, simply refusing to be intimidated by either the facility or the assembled audience of elite warriors. "This facility," Thornton continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone as if he were conducting a briefing rather than attempting to overwhelm a child, "is where we separate the professionals from the amateurs, where theoretical knowledge meets practical reality under conditions that simulate actual combat stress." He gestured toward a tall, powerfully built operator standing nearby, a man whose bearing and multiple deployment patches marked him as belonging to the very top tier of special operations. "The advanced course record is held by Master Sergeant Declan Cole of Delta Force, 9 hits out of 10 at 800 meters in variable conditions." Cole nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he studied Eva with the professional interest of a man who appreciated excellence regardless of its source. "Today," Thornton continued, his voice rich with false encouragement, "you'll be attempting a modified version of our qualification course. 5 shots at 500 meters under variable wind conditions, followed by 5 more at 800 meters with additional environmental challenges." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he added, "It's significantly more challenging than your previous demonstration, Miss Harper. Designed to test whether your earlier performance was genuine skill or simply beginner's luck under controlled conditions." Pierce stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who would not be dismissed or ignored. "As we agreed, Eva will use a standard issue M24 unmodified selected at random from your armory." Thornton nodded with exaggerated graciousness. "Of course, we wouldn't want any suggestion of impropriety or special accommodation." He gestured toward a weapon rack where a single rifle waited isolated like a specimen under glass. "Standard issue checked and verified by Sergeant Miller this morning. Everything by the book, completely transparent." Eva approached the rack, lifting the M24 with practiced hands that immediately detected the subtle wrongness. The balance was slightly off, imperceptible to someone unfamiliar with the weapon, but obvious to her trained touch. The trigger pull was heavier than standard specification, requiring perhaps an additional pound of pressure. Not obvious changes that could be easily proven as tampering, but subtle adjustments that would throw off a normal shooter, the kind of sabotage that lived in the gray area between malice and plausible deniability. She caught Pierce's eye across the room, a silent message passing between them with the efficiency of long practice. He nodded imperceptibly, confirming he saw it too, acknowledging that they had anticipated exactly this kind of gamesmanship. They had trained for this, hours spent with deliberately compromised equipment, learning to compensate for imperfections, adapt to irregularities, succeed despite sabotage. If Thornton thought a heavy trigger and poor balance would be enough to defeat her, he had seriously underestimated the thoroughness of her preparation and the depth of her father's paranoid genius. "Is there a problem with the weapon, Miss Harper?" Thornton asked, watching her examination with barely concealed anticipation, clearly expecting her to complain to provide him with the opportunity to dismiss her concerns as inexperience or excuse-making. Eva tested the bolt action, feeling the slight catch that had been engineered into its operation, the tiny impediment that would slow her cycling time between shots by fractions of seconds that could add up to mission failure in actual combat. "No, sir," she said calmly. "It's fine." Thornton's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment, quickly suppressed behind his mask of professional authority, and he... "Very well. Take your position when ready. Sergeant Miller will walk you through the course parameters." As Eva moved to the firing line, Pierce and the old guard veterans positioned themselves strategically around the facility, their decades of tactical experience evident in how they chose vantage points that would provide clear views of both Eva's shooting position and the downrange target areas. They had discussed this extensively over the past 2 weeks, ensuring that no matter what happened, no matter how Thornton might try to spin the narrative, multiple witnesses would have unobstructed observation of everything that transpired. Sergeant Miller approached Eva at the firing line, his manner professional but not unkind. A decent man caught between his duty to follow orders and his personal sense of what was right. Standard qualification protocol modified for current conditions. He explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating dangerous political waters. 5 rounds at 500 meters with variable winds up to 15 miles per hour, programmed to shift direction and intensity at random intervals. Eva nodded, absorbing the information with the focused attention her father had drilled into her. 15-mile-per-hour winds with random shifts was genuinely challenging, the kind of condition that could push even experienced operators to their limits, requiring constant adjustment and recalculation as atmospheric conditions changed faster than a shooter could compensate. Then 5 more at 800 meters, Miller continued, with the same variable wind conditions plus enhanced mirage effects and random target exposure times between 3 and 7 seconds. He paused, his expression showing a flicker of concern breaking through his professional facade. That's extremely demanding, Miss Harper. Most qualified snipers struggle with 800 meters even under ideal conditions. I understand, Sergeant, Eva replied, her voice steady with a confidence born from preparation meeting purpose. I'm ready. Miller studied her face for a moment, seeing something in her eyes that made him nod with what might have been respect. Any questions before we begin? No, Sergeant. I'm ready to proceed. Miller stepped back, raising his voice to address the assembled observers and participants. Range is hot. All personnel to designated observation positions. Shooter may commence when ready. Eva settled behind the rifle, her small frame finding the optimal position with practiced efficiency that drew surprised looks from several of the watching operators. The M24 felt wrong in her hands, the compromised balance and heavy trigger serving as constant reminders that this was an environment designed for her failure. But wrong didn't mean impossible. It just meant she had to be better, more precise, more focused than she would have needed to be with properly functioning equipment. The gathered operators watched with varied expressions, some openly skeptical, already composing the dismissive comments they would make when she failed. Others professionally curious, wondering if the viral videos had been accurate representations or clever editing designed to exaggerate a child's modest abilities. A few, mostly the older veterans who had seen enough combat to recognize genuine skill regardless of its source, watched with the kind of attention that suggested they expected to witness something unusual. Master Sergeant Cole studied her technique with particular interest, his experienced eye noting the textbook form. The careful weapon handling, the controlled breathing that spoke of deep training rather than natural talent alone. He had spent 20 years in special operations, had trained with and against some of the finest marksmen in the world, and what he saw in Eva Harper's preparation made him revise his initial assumptions about what was about to happen. Eva tuned out the whispers and the watching eyes, focusing entirely on the task ahead. She ran through her father's 5-point system one final time, each element now as natural as breathing after 3 weeks of intensive preparation. She drew a long breath, feeling her heart rate slow, her body settling into the kind of calm that comes from deep preparation meeting the moment it was designed for. The heavy trigger that was meant to throw her off became just another variable to account for, factored into her calculations like wind or distance, or the weight of history pressing down on this moment. The electronic system announced the first target presentation with a mechanical beep that seemed too small for the weight of what was about to happen. Eva's world narrowed to the view through her scope, to the distant silhouette that appeared 500 meters away, to the perfect execution of skills that had been 3 years in the making. 3 years of preparation for exactly this moment when everything her father had taught her would be tested under the worst conditions Thornton could create. Her finger took up the slack on the heavy trigger, compensating automatically for the additional resistance, finding that perfect balance point where the mechanism broke cleanly despite its sabotage. The rifle barked, its report echoing through the facility like a declaration of intent. Through her scope, Eva saw the target rock slightly as her round found center mass exactly where she had aimed despite the compromised equipment and challenging conditions. Without pausing to verify or celebrate, she worked the bolt smoothly, overcoming its engineered stiffness through technique rather than strength, chambering the next round with the practiced efficiency her father had demanded from the first day he taught her to shoot. The second target appeared, shifted by the variable wind that Thornton had programmed into the system. Eva's mind processed the new condition automatically, her point of aim adjusting with mathematical precision, her body following her intention with the unity of purpose that came from thousands of hours of practice. Another shot, another hit the target, responding to physics and skill with the honest directness that couldn't be compromised by politics or sabotage. 3 more targets, 3 more adjustments for the shifting wind that kept changing as design, testing her ability to read atmospheric conditions in real time, to process variables faster than conscious thought. 3 more perfect shots, each one delivered with the same methodical precision. Each one overcoming the subtle sabotage built into the weapon through compensation and adaptation. As the 5th target disappeared and Eva engaged the safety on her rifle, a murmur ran through the watching operators like wind through grass. Perfect score at 500 meters despite variable conditions and compromised equipment. The skeptics began revising their assumptions. The believers allowed themselves small smiles of vindication. Thornton's face betrayed nothing of his thoughts as he watched through binoculars from the observation booth. But those who knew him well might have detected the slight tightening around his eyes, the microscopic tension in his jaw that spoke of calculations being revised and contingencies being considered. "Prepare for the 800-meter stage," he ordered into the microphone that connected to Miller's earpiece. His voice clipped with the careful control of a man maintaining composure through force of will. "Standard protocol. No modifications." But they both knew that standard protocol for 800 meters in variable conditions was already more than enough challenge for even the most experienced operators. Adding compromised equipment and the pressure of public performance should have been insurmountable for a 12-year-old girl, regardless of her viral fame or genetic heritage. Should have been. But as Thornton watched Eva Harper adjust her scope for the increased distance, settling back into position with the same calm focus she had shown from the beginning, he felt the first cold whisper of doubt creeping into his certainty of her failure. Eva used the brief pause between stages to make the necessary adjustments for 800 meters. Her small fingers working the scope turrets with precision that spoke of deep familiarity. 800 meters was approaching the effective range limit of the M24 sniper system. A distance where bullet drop became measured in feet rather than inches, where wind drift could push around meters off target, where the Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation became a factor that couldn't be ignored. At this distance, marksmanship transformed from craft into science, requiring not just skill but mathematical precision and environmental awareness that took most operators years to develop. It was a test of calculation as much as shooting, a challenge that separated those who merely followed training from those who truly understood the physics of long-range precision fire. As she made her adjustments, Pierce moved closer to the firing line, kneeling beside her position. His voice was quiet, meant only for her ears, carrying the weight of experience earned across decades of combat. "Remember what your father taught you about extreme distance? It's not about the target. It's about the space between you and it. Every meter of air the bullet travels through, every shift in wind or temperature, every variable that physics throws at you." Eva nodded without taking her eye from the scope, her voice equally quiet but steady with certainty. "Dad used to say that at 800 meters you're not shooting at what you see. You're shooting at where everything will come together. The bullet, the target, the moment of impact. like conducting an orchestra where every instrument has to reach the perfect note at exactly the same instant. Pierce smiled slightly, hearing Marcus Harper's philosophy rendered perfectly by his daughter. That's right. Trust your calculations, trust your training, and trust that your father knew exactly what he was teaching you and why. The electronic system beeped again, announcing the start of the 800-meter stage. The first target would appear in seconds, visible only as a small silhouette at a distance, where atmospheric distortion made positive identification challenging, even with high-quality optics. Through her scope, Eva could see the visual wavering caused by heat mirage rising from the ground. The infamous shimmer effect that plagued long-distance shooters by making targets appear to dance and shift even when they remained perfectly still. This was where her father's Harper method became essential, where the 5-point system separated competent shooters from masters of the craft. Point 1. Calculate baseline trajectory. 800 meters with a 308 Winchester round meant approximately 295 inches of bullet drop from 100 meters zero. The round following a parabolic arc that required her to aim nearly 25 feet above the actual target to account for gravity's relentless pull. Point 2. Atmospheric conditions. Temperature, humidity, air density, each factor subtly affecting the bullet's flight path through physics that most people never considered but that determined success or failure at extreme distances. The facility's climate control maintained 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 42% humidity conditions. She had memorized and factored into her calculations before ever settling behind the rifle. Point 3. Wind reading. Not just at her position but across the entire 800-meter path to the target. Eva detected the artificial crosswind generated by the facility's hidden fans, currently 12 miles per hour from her 3 o'clock position, but with a slight variation at the mid-range point where it shifted to approximately 10 miles per hour. The wind wouldn't remain constant. Thornton had programmed it to vary unpredictably, testing her ability to read and adapt in real time. Point 4. Coriolis effect. At this latitude and firing direction, Earth's rotation would shift the bullet approximately 3 inches at 800 meters, a small factor, but one that couldn't be ignored when center mass accuracy was the difference between success and failure, between honoring her father's legacy and confirming Thornton's narrative of her as a child playing with tools beyond her comprehension. Point 5. The space between heartbeats. The moment of perfect stillness when the body achieved a calm so complete that even the subtle movement of pulse and respiration paused, creating a window measured in fractions of seconds where the shot could be delivered with absolute precision. Eva made her final adjustments, her small fingers moving the scope turrets with decisive confidence. When she settled back into position, her breathing slowed to the measured rhythm her father had drilled into her from the first day she had touched a rifle. 4 seconds in natural pause, 4 seconds out, finding the biological rhythm that allowed her body to become an extension of the weapon rather than a source of unwanted movement. The first target appeared at 800 meters, barely larger than a postage stamp in her scope's magnification. Eva's mind processed the variables with practiced efficiency, her point of aim settling on a spot that seemed impossibly far above and to the left of the actual target, compensation for physics that demanded respect rather than hope. The rifle fired the heavy trigger, breaking cleanly despite its sabotage. Through her scope, Eva watched the target respond with the honest physics of a well-placed shot. The silhouette rocking backward as her round found center mass after its nearly 2-second flight through variable wind and atmospheric conditions that would have defeated shooters with far more experience. She worked the bolt, fighting its engineered stiffness, chambering the next round while her mind was already processing the next target presentation. The electronic system was randomizing exposure times between 3 and 7 seconds, as Miller had warned, forcing her to calculate and engage targets under time pressure that simulated combat conditions where enemies didn't wait patiently to be shot. The second target appeared and Eva's training took over. Her conscious mind faded into the background as muscle memory and practiced instinct executed the Harper method with the fluid efficiency of a well-rehearsed symphony. Calculate, account, read, adjust, fire. Each step flowing into the next without pause or hesitation, her body and mind working in perfect synchronization. Third target. Fourth target. Each one requiring slightly different adjustments as Thornton's programmed wind variations tested her adaptability. Each one falling to shots that proved her father's training hadn't been the indulgent hobby of a soldier teaching his daughter to shoot, but rather the careful cultivation of genuine expertise by a master craftsman who understood that excellence transcended age or gender or conventional expectations. The fifth and final target at 800 meters appeared with only 3 seconds of exposure time, the minimum the system allowed a challenge, designed to force rushed decisions and compromised accuracy. But Eva had trained for this exact scenario. Her father had taught her that time pressure was just another variable to account for, that panic was the enemy, and calm calculation the only path to success. She acquired the target, processed the ballistics with practiced speed, and delivered her shot with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout. The target dropped, registering a hit that Sergeant Miller confirmed through his spotting scope, with visible amazement that broke through his professional neutrality. 10 for 10, Miller announced, his voice carrying across the facility with a note of disbelief that he couldn't quite suppress. All center mass, perfect score at both distances. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the facility's ventilation system and the whisper of wind through the artificial terrain features. Then slowly the assembled operators began to react, some with quiet murmurs of appreciation, others with the kind of silence that spoke of assumptions being shattered and worldviews being revised. Master Sergeant Cole stepped forward, his weathered face showing the first genuine expression of emotion since the demonstration began. He approached Eva with the bearing of a warrior, offering respect to an equal, extending his hand as she stood from the firing line. "That was masterful shooting, Miss Harper," he said as they shook hands, his deep voice carrying absolute sincerity. "Your father was the finest sniper I ever served with, and what you just demonstrated proves that excellence runs in the Harper bloodline. You've earned the right to stand among us." Eva accepted his words with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout, neither celebrating her victory nor diminishing the magnitude of what she had accomplished. "Thank you, Master Sergeant Cole. My father spoke highly of the operators he served alongside. He would be honored to know I earned your respect." Thornton stood apart from the growing congratulations, his face a rigid mask of controlled fury as he watched his carefully planned humiliation transform into Eva's triumph. When General Preston Howard approached from the observation booth where he had been watching the entire demonstration, Thornton straightened instinctively to attention, military conditioning overriding his emotional turmoil. "Quite a performance, wouldn't you say, Colonel?" Howard's voice carried deceptive mildness that barely concealed the steel beneath. 10 for 10 at both distances in variable conditions with equipment that I'm told was somewhat less than optimal. Makes one wonder what Miss Harper might accomplish with properly functioning gear and fair conditions." Thornton's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. "An impressive demonstration, certainly, sir. Though I would caution against drawing broader conclusions from a single performance under controlled conditions. Combat effectiveness requires more than marksmanship alone." "Indeed," Howard agreed, his eyes never leaving Thornton's face. "It also requires integrity, sound judgment, and the willingness to support one's subordinates rather than sabotaging them out of petty jealousy or wounded pride." Before Thornton could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a 3-star general whose appearance sent a ripple of recognition through the assembled operators. General Thomas Aldridge, commander of Joint Special Operations Command, moved through the facility with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades at the highest levels of America's military elite. "General Howard!" Aldridge greeted his colleague with a nod before turning his attention to Thornton. "Colonel Thornton, I believe we have matters to discuss. My office has received some concerning information regarding communications logs from Operation Saber Strike, the Syria mission that resulted in Master Sergeant Harper's death." Thornton's face went carefully neutral, but those watching closely might have detected the slight pallor that spread across his features. "Sir, those operations remain classified. I'm not certain this is the appropriate venue for such discussions." "I have the necessary clearances, Colonel," Aldridge replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that came from unquestionable authority. "As does the Inspector General, who will be conducting a comprehensive review of all materials related to Master Sergeant Harper's final mission. If there were delays in support authorization, if crucial intelligence was ignored or suppressed, if personal animosity influenced tactical decisions that cost American lives, there will be consequences regardless of rank or service record." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Around them, the facility had gone silent as operators and observers recognized they were witnessing something significant, a reckoning that had been building for years finally beginning to unfold. Thornton opened his mouth to respond, but Aldridge continued before he could speak. "I was in Afghanistan when Marcus Harper made his record shot, 2,125 meters confirmed kill that saved a CIA team from ambush. The official record attributed that shot to operational command decisions rather than individual marksmanship. Your decisions, Colonel, as I recall from the after-action reports." He paused, letting the accusation settle. "Seems there's a pattern of you claiming credit for Harper's achievements while simultaneously undermining his career through administrative reprimands and delayed support when he needed it most. The Inspector General is very interested in exploring that pattern in detail." Thornton's composure finally cracked fear, breaking through the careful mask he had maintained for so long. "General, the operational environment in Syria was extremely complex. Decisions had to be made with limited information under time pressure. Any delays in support authorization were the result of legitimate tactical considerations, not personal." "Save it for the investigation, Colonel," Aldridge interrupted, his voice hardening. "For now, I believe we have a young lady who has earned recognition for an extraordinary demonstration of skill. Recognition that should be given freely rather than grudgingly." He turned toward Eva, his expression softening slightly as he approached. "Miss Harper, that was some of the finest shooting I've witnessed in 40 years of military service. Your father would be extraordinarily proud not just of your marksmanship, but of your character and determination in pursuing truth despite significant obstacles." Eva stood at attention, overwhelmed by the presence of such high-ranking authority but maintaining the composure that had become her signature. "Thank you, sir. My father taught me that shooting was never just about hitting targets. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves and standing up for truth even when it was difficult or dangerous." Aldridge nodded, genuine respect evident in his eyes. "A lesson many could benefit from learning. I'm authorizing the full declassification of your father's service record, including the Afghanistan shot and other operations that were buried for reasons that had more to do with politics than legitimate security concerns. The world deserves to know the full truth about Master Sergeant Marcus Harper's contributions to his country." He glanced back at Thornton, whose face had gone ashen. "Additionally, I'm pleased to announce the establishment of the Harper Marksmanship Academy, a specialized training program that will preserve and teach the methods your father developed. We'd be honored if you would consider serving as a civilian instructor, sharing his legacy with the next generation of warriors." The offer hung in the air, transforming Eva's personal quest for justice into something larger, something that would ensure her father's techniques and philosophy survived beyond memory, codified into training doctrine that would save lives for decades to come. Eva looked to Pierce, who stood nearby with tears glistening in his weathered eyes. He nodded encouragement, giving her permission to accept what her father would have wanted, what 3 years of preparation and sacrifice had been building toward. "I would be honored, General Aldridge," Eva said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "My father believed deeply in passing knowledge forward, in ensuring that the lessons learned through hard experience weren't lost, but rather became the foundation for future excellence. Teaching at an academy bearing his name would be the highest honor I could imagine." Aldridge smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth. "Excellent. We'll begin implementation immediately. Master Sergeant Harper's methods deserve to be preserved and shared, not buried and forgotten, because of one man's insecurity and moral failure. The final phrase was delivered while looking directly at Thornton, leaving no doubt about who bore responsibility for attempting to erase Marcus Harper's legacy. Thornton stood rigid, his career and reputation crumbling around him like a building whose foundation had finally given way after years of bearing weight it was never designed to support. As the assembled operators began to disperse, many approaching Eva to offer personal congratulations and share memories of serving with her father, Pierce, drew her aside to a quiet corner of the facility. His weathered face showed the complex emotions of a man watching a promise fulfilled and a brother's honor restored. "Your father would be proud, Eva," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not just of the shooting, though that was exceptional, but of how you conducted yourself throughout this entire ordeal. You could have sought revenge, could have let anger drive you to humiliate Thornton the way he attempted to humiliate you. Instead, you pursued truth with dignity and let the facts speak for themselves." Eva nodded, fatigue finally beginning to show in her young face now that the adrenaline was fading. "Dad used to say that revenge was for people who had given up on justice, that the difference between the two was whether you were trying to hurt someone or trying to make things right. I didn't want to hurt Colonel Thornton. I just wanted the truth about Dad to be known. And now it will be," Pierce assured her. "The investigation, the declassification, the academy, all of it means your father's true story will finally be told. The Marines he saved in Fallujah will finally be able to publicly acknowledge what he did. The Delta operators from Syria can speak openly about how he held off 18 attackers to buy them time to escape. His techniques will be taught to save future lives. That's justice, Eva. That's making it right." They were interrupted by Sergeant Miller, who approached carrying Eva's rifle and a small box. His expression was serious, almost contrite. "Ms. Harper, I wanted to personally apologize for any role I played in Colonel Thornton's attempts to sabotage your performance. The trigger weight modification and bolt manipulation were done at his direct order, but that doesn't excuse my participation." He extended the box toward her. "This belonged to your father. It's been in the armory since his death, held pending proper disposition. I think it should go to you now." Eva opened the box to find a custom-built upper receiver for an M24 machined to tolerances beyond military specification, hand-fitted and tuned by someone who understood that perfection was achieved through attention to details most people never noticed. Her father's personal rifle component, the tool he had used to achieve the shades that divined his legend. "Thank you, Sergeant Miller," she said softly, running her fingers over the precision metalwork. "This means more than you know." Miller nodded, emotion breaking through his professional demeanor. "Your father was the finest sniper I ever had the privilege of working with." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I should have refused Colonel Thornton's orders to sabotage your equipment. Should have stood up for what was right." His voice carried genuine regret. "I'm sorry it took a 12-year-old girl to show me what integrity looks like. You verified my hits honestly when Thornton wanted you to lie," Eva replied. "That took courage too, Sergeant. My father would have respected that." Miller's jaw tightened with gratitude. "What you did here today, proving his methods work despite everything thrown at you, that's the memorial he deserves." As Miller returned to his duties, Eva cradled the box containing her father's rifle component, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility it represented. This wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a connection across the years to a man who had known he might not survive to see his daughter grow up, who had prepared her for exactly this moment through years of patient training and careful documentation. The video of Eva's SFAMC performance went viral even faster than her initial demonstration, viewed tens of millions of times within the first week. News networks ran extensive features on the Harper story, interviewing the Marines from Fallujah, who finally felt safe speaking publicly about what Marcus Harper had done, talking to the Delta operators from Syria who described his final stand against overwhelming odds while Thornton delayed the support that might have saved him. The investigation into Thornton's conduct was swift and thorough, uncovering a pattern of stolen valor and sabotaged careers spanning 2 decades. The communications logs from Syria preserved by a suspicious signals officer who had sensed something wrong proved that Thornton had received Harper's warning about the ambush and chosen to ignore it, then deliberately delayed air support authorization while Harper and his team fought for their lives. 3 months after Eva's SFAMC demonstration, Colonel Richard Thornton was dishonorably discharged from the Army, stripped of rank and pension, his medals and commendations revoked. Criminal charges were considered but ultimately not pursued, the evidence strong enough to destroy his career but falling just short of the threshold required for prosecution under military law. For Eva, the outcome brought a sense of completion rather than satisfaction. She had never sought Thornton's destruction, only her father's vindication. That the two outcomes proved inseparable said more about Thornton's choices than her intentions. 6 months after the SFAMC performance, on a crisp spring morning that carried the promise of renewal, Eva stood beside her father's grave at Arlington National Cemetery. The headstone had been updated to reflect his full service record, no longer sanitized by Thornton's lies, but instead honestly documenting a career of extraordinary courage and skill. Master Sergeant Marcus Harper, Medal of Honor, promoted posthumously from lieutenant. The inscription read, "Verified record holder, 2,125-meter precision shot, saved countless lives through exceptional skill and unwavering moral courage. A warrior who chose conscience over career and paid the ultimate price for protecting those who could not protect themselves." Eva placed fresh flowers beside the marker, then carefully arranged 2 items on the small granite shelf built into its base. Her father's Medal of Honor, temporarily removed from its display case for this private ceremony. Beside it, she placed her own newly awarded Civilian Service Medal of Honor, presented by General Aldridge in recognition of her role in exposing corruption and preserving her father's legacy. "It's done, Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying across the precise rows of white markers that stretched in perfect alignment as far as the eye could see. "Everyone knows the truth now. About Fallujah, about Syria, about everything Thornton tried to bury. Your name has been cleared, your methods preserved, your legacy secured." The spring breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees, the only sound in the peaceful sanctuary where America's honored dead rested. Eva knelt beside the grave, touching the cold marble with gentle fingers. The Harper Marksmanship Academy opened last month. She continued, speaking to her father as if he could hear, as if the boundary between life and death was permeable enough for love and determination to cross. "We have 43 students already, ranging from new recruits to experienced operators who want to learn the Harper method properly. Pierce teaches the advanced courses, sharing the techniques you developed together over all those years." She smiled slightly, a hint of pride breaking through the solemnity. "And I broke your long-distance record last week. 2,247 meters, verified by 3 independent spotters, including General Aldridge. He said it was the most impressive shot he'd witnessed in his entire career." The smile faded as deeper emotions surfaced. "But the records don't really matter, do they? Not compared to the lives you saved, the principles you stood for, the truth you preserved through all those journals, even when you knew it might cost you everything. You taught me that shooting was never about the target. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. About standing up for what's right even when it's hard. About choosing integrity over advancement." Eva stood, slowly straightening to attention as her father had taught her, rendering a salute that would have made any drill instructor proud. "Mission accomplished, Dad. Your honor restored, your legacy secured, your daughter making you proud in every way that matters." She lowered her salute and turned to find Pierce waiting respectfully at a distance, giving her the privacy she needed for this final conversation with her father. But he wasn't alone. The old guard had gathered Mallory and Sutton and Donovan and Wilson men who had made Eva's mission their own. When she reached them, they stood at attention, as one rendering a final salute not to her, but through her to the brother they had lost. "Your father would say we're getting silent in our old age. Mallory said gruffly, emotion thick in his voice. Standing around a cemetery getting misty-eyed. He'd also say mission accomplished deserves recognition. Sutton countered, his scarred face solemn. The girl did what we couldn't, made it right. Eva shook each man's hand, accepting their quiet words of pride and farewell. They had been her army when she needed one, her teachers when she needed wisdom, her witnesses when she needed truth validated. Now their watch was ending, the mission complete. "You'll still teach at the academy?" Donovan asked. "Every week," Eva confirmed. "Dad's methods deserve to live on, and you're all invited to guest lecture whenever you want." Wilson, the tall veteran who had verified her first impossible grouping, smiled. "Might take you up on that. Been a while since I taught young shooters the old ways." They walked together to the cemetery gates where vehicles waited. Pierce's truck stood apart from the others, and Eva moved toward it naturally, their partnership forged through 3 years of preparation, now an unbreakable bond. "The Academy has a demonstration scheduled at Quantico next week," Pierce said as they drove away from Arlington. "FBI hostage rescue team wants to see if the Harper method works for their precision shooting requirements. They're pretty confident their operators can hold their own against a 12-year-old girl." Eva smiled, the expression carrying echoes of her father's quiet confidence. "They're welcome to try, Sergeant Major. They're welcome to try." The truck pulled away from the cemetery, carrying them toward a future built on the foundation Marcus Harper had laid through years of patient teaching and careful documentation. Behind them, the spring sun illuminated countless white markers standing in perfect rows, each one representing a promise kept, a duty fulfilled, a life given in service to something larger than self. Among them, Marcus Harper's grave stood as testament to a truth that Thornton's lies had tried to bury but could never erase. That excellence transcends rank or politics. That integrity matters more than advancement. That a father's love expressed through patient teaching and preserved through detailed journals could reach across the boundary of death to guide his daughter toward justice and ensure his legacy lived on in ways no amount of stolen valor could prevent. Eva Harper had kept her promise. And in doing so, she had proven that some things, truth and honor among them, couldn't be killed by bullets or buried by bureaucracy. They only waited, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to bring them back into the light. The Harper legacy would continue passed forward through generations of warriors who would learn that the perfect shot required perfect truth. Not just in aim, but in purpose. Not just in technique, but in character. One shot, one life, not to kill, but to protect. The foundation of everything Marcus Harper had stood for, preserved and honored by a daughter who had transformed grief into determination and loss into legacy. The perfect shot delivered with perfect timing, achieving perfect justice. Just as her father had taught her it should be.